Welcome back to the Wallace branch, and today we're coming back to the heart of the route, Wallace, Idaho, and getting ready for the filming of the legendary box office flop, the movie Heaven's Gate, directed by Michael Cimino for United Artists in the summer of 1979. This episode is going to focus on creating a few props for the movie filming scene, and we'll be watching Blender time lapses of about 4 or 5 assets. So if you are eager to get back into Trainz, I'm just warning you. Only a few scenes of the long movie were actually filmed in Wallace. I'd guess not more than 15 minutes of a 3-hour plus flick. But it was a big deal for the town, which had to shut down for almost 8 weeks. The movie was a disaster both because of poor reviews and its immense cost overruns. The movie's costs hardly seem excessive by today's standards, but given that the movie only screened in a few theaters for a couple of days, the losses were enough to essentially bankrupt United Artists, which was part of Transamerica, and so the company quickly dumped the studio to MGM. Anyway, I'm starting with the Panavision movie camera, the Panaflex. There are lots of diagrams and photos of this camera online, and it's instantly recognizable to movie aficionados given the Panavision logo at the end of all the best movies of a generation. Movies like Star Wars, Lawrence of Arabia, Jaws, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Maybe the camera only plays a starring role in one film, though.
This goddamn lens, there's something wrong with it.
What, this one too? I changed lenses.
What are you talking about? The focus is off.
Lens, I mean Mel himself.
Let me see that. Get the hell out of here. I don't believe it. You're right. Mel's out of focus.
What? What the hell are you talking about?
But I'd still call this camera iconic. Could you really create a scene to represent the filming of a great movie in 1979 without including a Panavision camera and in proper detail? My answer would be no. I created the Panavision camera after finishing the building assets in Wallace and also the mining assets of Burke, and this is where I finally started feeling kind of comfortable in Blender. And this is maybe after 100 assets or so that gives you an idea of the learning curve for Blender. If you had a different set of assets to create other than square buildings, maybe you would learn more Blender tricks faster. I only included a few minor PBR aspects in this build, basically just the shiny metal parts, and even that you hardly notice. It's one of the things I've learned. Basically, one text can do a lot. You don't need to do PBR for everything. Even if it seems like it might look better, it's not always the case. Next, if we're going to have a Panavision camera, we need the camera truck too, right? After all, there are obviously crane shots in a number of scenes of Heaven's Gate. How could there not be, given that this whole film was intended to showcase the poetry of America through epic scenery, a kind of Lawrence of Arabia in the US Northwest? The Chapman movie crane is perhaps less of an icon than the Panavision camera, but it's still recognizable and venerable in its own way. I love how little the vehicle has changed over the years. Clearly, it's a philosophy of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. According to the company's website, the Chapman-Leonard story begins in Southern California in 1945, when Ralph Chapman created the Chapman Studio Equipment Company in order to design and manufacture a more versatile camera crane. The Hercules mobile crane was developed, offering a leveling system, six-wheeled crabbing abilities, and the ability to drive the unit to location. Chapman built the crane for Cecil DeMille's Paramount production of The Greatest Show on Earth in 1950 and his remake of The Ten Commandments in 1952. One of the first road trips that took the unit out of Hollywood was for DeMille's Circus Extravaganza, when it was used to film actual circus performances in Washington, D.C. In 1961, Chapman introduced the Chapman Titan crane. This was a major improvement over all previous support gear because it has a reach of 17 feet, a lens height of 27 feet, or 37 feet with its camera riser mounted. And the system also carried more than just a camera and an operator. It can handle the director, an assistant cameraman, and an operator for the two Brute arc lamps that could be mounted on board. The company is still in the family today. As of 2020, Charles Leonard, the grandson of Leonard Chapman, has stepped in as president and CEO of Chapman Leonard. The camera truck was not my first vehicle. You've probably already seen the flexible Starliner, but it was the first where I decided I needed to use PBR Painter to give it a bit of texture from the beginning. I wasn't going all out for a weathered look, just trying to make it look interesting, creating a bit of ambient occlusion and dusting over the top. Now we turn to some of the actual props for the movie. If you've played Trainz and tried to make an Old West scene or just an older scene in the United States somewhere, you probably know that there are a lot of good Old West assets like wagons and wagon wheels and things like that. But they're all very Old West, and there's not that much variety. There's not more high-end things that look new or good-looking. In the movie, however, Cimino wanted to portray Casper, Wyoming as a fairly prosperous boomtown, and he wanted to portray Chris Christopherson's character, Jim Averill, as a rich Harvard graduate giving a luxurious buggy to his girlfriend, the sexy and vivacious frontier madam Ella Watson, who was played by Isabelle Huppert. He arrives in Casper, in other words, Wallace, Idaho, with the buggy lashed to a flat car, And the longest scene set in Wallace contains a lot of expository dialogue with the background of the unloading and preparing of this buggy as poor immigrants are clambering down from a cattle car and an emigrant boxcar in the rear of the train. This is a small asset, but I did go all out. I was not only using PBR Painter to add some ambient occlusion and weathering, but also painting on the cushion texture and the leather texture for the canopy. Later, I created a couple other versions of this buggy with the canopy deployed, and there were quite a few buggies and carriages circling around the set during the filming of this scene. In fact, my dad took quite a few pictures when he was on the set around the depot area at that time. The photos are kind of fuzzy though, but I think it shows that the extras were having a great time. And a lot of the extras were actually locals from Idaho and Montana, especially from the Kalispell area. Most of the crew who weren't locals, they just stayed at the Outlaw Inn in Kalispell, and they commuted several hours to Wallace for the 3 weeks or so that it took to film this one scene. Anyway, this is now one of my favorite assets, but it does have one downside. I don't think I'm quite good enough to do any horses, so I'm just going to plop down some DLS horses into the set and make do. It's a little funny putting in so much detail down to the gold stencils in the corners and then not really getting the horses right after all. But model railroading and gameplay of Trainz, they're all about artistic compromises, and I hope you agree I made a reasonable triage choice here. My first train car for Trainz was the Emigrant car, which was used in the movie. And I started with these photos, but I also had a blueprint of a Northern Pacific maintenance of way car. And I think the car probably was an old NP maintenance of way car, maybe from Missoula. Anyway, I bet it was from Montana. In the photos, it looks gray or white to me, so I based my initial effort on that. And I kept it just extremely simple. I did use PBR Painter to make the streaks and the stencils, and since this was my first car, I got it looking good as a scenery asset first, and I even lined it up next to other train cars to make sure the dimensions and height off the ground looked pretty good. And that's when it enabled me to keep going on this project, because earlier I tried to make a car with just a cube, and I thought, that would be a logical thing, just make it simple and see if I could upload it as a train car asset with attachment points, couplers, and bogies, and the front and back. But in that first experiment, I still didn't have anything to show for my work, and I didn't really learn anything. So by creating this as a scenery asset first and getting it looking good, that gave me some momentum or inspiration to continue. I must have read the wikis and looked at every YouTube video about making a new car asset for Trainz, but still I think some things are really hard to figure out on your own. First, the car has to be lined up on the y-axis, and if you forgot to do that and put it on the x-axis, which is only natural, then you get an error because Trainz thinks that the bogies and front and back are all in the same y location. And the error, of course, does not directly say that your model should be lined up properly on the y-axis. The next thing was the error about needing an LM file instead of a mesh file. Train car assets now require this. Fortunately, this is really just a matter of copying someone else's LM file. It's one extra step, and it's actually a useful one because once you know how to create an LM file, you can use them for other assets, and you can also upgrade older assets. For example, they can't have attachment points that point to a Trainz mesh file because they're in an older Trainz version. So upgrading them requires adding an LM file and changing the version. And so once you know how to do an LM file, then you know how to do that too. Then you have to figure out which direction to point the arrows of the empties. And maybe you can use what I'm showing on screen here as a guide. I started with the limb front and limb back in the wrong direction. Anyway, you can see which direction they should be pointing by looking at this face-on view, which is using the 3 key on the numpad to orient the viewpoint. And the same thing goes for the direction of the bogies and the couplers. I didn't get them right at first either. For the coupler asset that I used, the arrows have to be pointed inward towards the center or origin, but I'm not sure if that would be the case for all couplers. And I think the issue is that for many car assets, there is no separate coupler asset. It's just integrated into the mesh of the car itself. In case you are wondering why this car is labeled for the Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Railroad, this relates to the subject of the movie Heaven's Gate. Wallace was supposed to represent the frontier town of Casper, Wyoming, during the onset of violence between wealthy ranchers and their hired guns versus some immigrant farmers. The FEMV was established in Nebraska in 1869, and initially it was just in Nebraska. Fremont and Elkhorn are both towns near Omaha. But eventually the FEMV extended into Wyoming. Its advertising slogan was "Free Homes for the Million," and it encouraged emigration for good government land, namely land that was recently ceded or taken from the Omaha Reservation. The railroad reached Douglas, Wyoming in around 1886, or at least that's when the depot was built, and then it reached Casper in 1888. So during the Johnson County War, the subject of Heaven's Gate, when the army of invaders led by Frank Kenton arrived to carry out its death list, that was 1892, well, the FEMV would have indeed been serving Casper at that time. Lastly, when I looked at the movie again, I realized that this car was actually red, not white. And it's weird how you try to do your homework with reference images, and then after finishing, you always find the one photo that sends you back to your model for another try. But the black and white photos definitely didn't make that obvious, and I just thought the color ones that looked reddish were kind of like in shadow or something. I also decided to go back later and do louvers instead of window glass, and to change the door a little bit. And I figured I'd practice my skills on PBR Painter again and some minor details. I added in the louvers, refined the brake wheel, and I put some metal corner hangers and rusted them all with PBR Painter. And I think the final result looks great. Okay, lastly, having done the camera, the truck, the buggy, and the Emigrant car, it's time to start in on the people in the movie, starting with the legendary, and some would say infamous, director, Michael Cimino. On the set, he always wore a lucky green scarf that his girlfriend and credited producer Joanne Corelli had given him to wear while shooting the film. He also sported a Yankees baseball cap, even though he became known on the set and by the crew as the Ayatollah because of his arbitrary dictates and strict orders. And if Michael Cimino took the fall for the failure of his film, let's also give him and his colleagues credit for the film's ultimate revival as kind of an artistic and cult classic. And especially, let's give credit to Wallace Zsigmond, who was responsible for cinematography. In photos taken on set, Zsigmond is often shown looking through the camera eyepiece, studying and prepping the shots. Zsigmond was one of the leading players in the American New Wave cinema. He worked with Robert Altman, Steven Spielberg, Brian De Palma, and Woody Allen, among others. His most famous two films for which he won Academy Awards were Close Encounters of the Third Kind and The Deer Hunter. His film McCabe and Mrs. Miller won the American Cinematographers Society's 50 Best Shot Films from 1950 to 1997. To create these characters, I used a combination of the Blender Face Builder add-on and the free version of Make Human. If you've used Make Human, you may notice that Wallace Zsigmond is wearing the default outfit from that software. I also found manipulating the rigs was difficult and a bit fussy, but the process kind of looks fun on the time-lapse. Anyway, that's a lot of asset creation for one episode, and really just a taste of what I ended up doing for this movie scene. So what's next? Well, it's time to follow in the footsteps of Michael Cimino, because we need to give Wallace, Idaho a makeover to transform it into the amazing set of Heaven's Gate, or in other words, a highly fictionalized Old West version of Casper, Wyoming. If you want to be there, like and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time on the Wallace Branch.